Your Grace, you must help me. I don't know where else to turn.
Your Grace.
She had exactly 30 seconds before Lord Vallon cornered her. Katerina Ashford knew this the way she knew everything. Quietly, precisely, and far too late to do anything graceful about it. She could see him cutting through the crowd of the Thornwell Winter Gala, his broad shoulders parting silk gowns and tailored coats like a ship through still water. His eyes were already on her, had been with her all evening, and the smile he wore was the kind that never reached anything deeper than teeth. He was coming to collect her father's debt, her father's promise. Her father, who had been dead for 6 months, and had apparently spent the last 2 years of his life gambling away every Ashford holding, including, it now seemed, his eldest daughter's future. To Lord Edric Vallon, a man who collected things the way other men collected paintings, beautifully, permanently, without sentiment. Katerina set her champagne flute on a passing tray and turned. She needed a wall at her back, a crowd between them, or a miracle. And the Thornwell Ballroom, for all its gilded excess, offered none of those things. What it offered instead was a man standing alone near the far column. He had his back half turned to the room, one hand resting loosely at his side, the other holding a glass he hadn't touched. He wore no military decorations, no house colors, nothing that announced rank or allegiance. His coat was dark and plain by the standards of the evening. His jaw was sharp. His posture was the kind of stillness that didn't come from patience. It came from absolute certainty that the room would arrange itself around him if he waited long enough. Katerina didn't think. She moved. She crossed the floor in 12 steps, placed her gloved hand on the stranger's arm, leaned close enough that her voice would carry only to him, and said the most desperate thing she had ever said in her 24 years of careful, composed living. "Please, pretend to be my husband, just for tonight." The man went very still, not startled. She registered that immediately. Not confused, just still. The way a predator goes still when something unexpected crosses its path and it hasn't yet decided what to do about it. He turned his head. Slowly. His eyes were gray, the particular gray of winter sky just before a storm breaks. Not quite blue, not quite silver, carrying the distinct impression that whatever came next would be neither gentle nor avoidable. He looked at her for 3 full seconds without speaking. She felt every one of them. Then he said, "Very well." 2 words, quiet as a closing door. And he turned to face Lord Vallon, who had arrived, red-faced and satisfied, behind Katerina's left shoulder, with the expression of a man who had just discovered something mildly irritating in his peripheral vision. "Lady Katerina," Vallon's voice was silk over gravel, "I've been looking for you. Have you?" The stranger said it the way men say things when they are not asking questions. Not hostile, simply certain. His hand had moved without her noticing, settling at the small of her back, light as a promise, steady as stone. Vallon blinked. His gaze moved to the stranger's face, then dropped, just slightly, then came back up. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite recognition, more like the instinct of a man who has learned, through experience, that certain rooms contain certain people who should not be tested. "I wasn't aware Lady Katerina had he let the pause stretch meaningfully. "Husband?" The stranger supplied the word with gentle precision. "Most people aren't. We prefer it that way." He looked down at Katerina then, and the shift in his gaze was startling. It softened, just at the edges, enough to be convincing, enough to make her heart do something entirely unreasonable. "Shall we find somewhere quieter, my love? You look tired, my love." He said it the way people say things they have said 1,000 times, effortlessly, without hesitation, as if the words had lived in his mouth long before tonight. Katerina, who had not been called anyone's love in her entire memory, felt the warmth of it like a candle lit in a cold room, and immediately reminded herself that it was a performance. A kindness from a stranger, nothing more. "Yes," she managed. "Please." Vallon said nothing as the stranger guided her away, but she heard his silence the way you hear a door that hasn't quite latched, full of the promise that it would open again. They found a quieter alcove near the east corridor, half hidden behind a sweep of heavy curtains. The stranger released her the moment they were out of sight, stepping back to a courteous distance that somehow felt colder than his nearness had. Katerina turned to face him. "Thank you," she said. "Truly. I know that was... I apologize for the presumption. You didn't have to... Who is he?" The interruption was not unkind, just direct. He was watching her with those winter eyes, and she had the peculiar sensation of being read, not judged, simply read. As one reads a letter, looking for what is actually being communicated beneath the words on the surface. "Lord Edric Vallon," she said. "He holds a debt against my family's estate. My father," she paused. "Draw a breath. My father made promises before he died that I was not informed of. Lord Vallon has been attempting to collect on one of them, and that collection involves you personally." It was not a question. She answered it anyway. "He wants to formalize a betrothal. He has the paperwork. He has the legal standing, apparently. My solicitor is working to challenge it, but until that challenge is resolved, he can approach you at every public function with full social impunity." The stranger finished quietly. He was quiet for a moment, looking past her shoulder at the ballroom beyond. "How long do you have before the challenge is resolved?" 2 weeks, perhaps 3. Something moved across his expression. Brief, unreadable. Then it was gone. "Does he know your solicitor's name?" Katerina frowned. Yes, I imagine so. Why?" The stranger didn't answer that. He looked back at her, and again she had the sensation of being assessed by something far more thorough than ordinary attention. "Can you endure 1 more hour of this evening?" he asked. "If I stay near you, Vallon won't approach again tonight, but I have a matter I need to attend to before we leave." "We." She caught the word and filed it away with the others. "My love, we," vocabulary of a man who had stepped into this role with impossible ease. "I can manage an hour," she said carefully, "but I would like to know your name, if we are to be convincing." Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. It might have been a smile, if smiles were this restrained. "Raphael," he said. Just the one name. No family, no title, nothing she could place. "Katerina Ashford," she offered in return. "I know." She blinked. "You know?" But he had already turned back toward the ballroom, and when she followed, she found that the crowd did, in fact, rearrange itself, subtly, instinctively, like grass bending before a wind it had learned to recognize. People stepped aside without quite realizing they were doing it. Conversations faltered at the edges as he passed. Ladies who had been animatedly engaged with their companions found reasons to glance over. He was not loud. He was not demanding. He simply moved through the room as though he had never, in his life, considered that anything might not make way for him. Katerina walked beside him and felt, for the first time in 6 months, like something other than a target. The hour passed with strange ease. He brought her a fresh glass of champagne without being asked, appearing at her shoulder so silently she nearly startled. He positioned himself in every conversation to deflect the sharp edges, the prying questions about her family's finances, the pointed condolences that were not condolences at all but excavations. When Lord Vallon circled twice at a distance, watching, Raphael simply turned his head and looked back at him. Just looked, and Vallon found other directions to face. It should have felt theatrical. It did not. What felt theatrical and increasingly uncomfortable was how natural it all was. The way Raphael's hand would find the small of her back when someone pressed too close. The way he remembered what she'd mentioned in passing, that she disliked the East Salon's cloying floral arrangements, that she'd attended this gala every year since she was 15, and wove those details into conversation as if he'd known her for years, as if he'd been paying attention to her long before tonight, which was impossible. They had never met, hadn't they? She studied his profile during a lull between conversations. The sharp jaw, the way he stood, weight forward, shoulders back, the stance of someone accustomed to making final decisions. Something nagged at the edge of her recognition. Not his face, precisely. Something about the quality of his attention. Something about the room's behavior around him. Then the evening bell rang, announcing the final hour, and Raphael turned to her. "I'll see you in your carriage," he said. She didn't argue. They retrieved her wrap and moved through the departing crowd toward the grand front steps of Thornwell House, where carriages were already forming their queue in the frost-sharp night air. The cold hit her the moment they stepped outside. Clear, clean, and absolute, the kind of cold that burns the inside of the nose and turns breath to silver. She pulled her wrap tighter. Raphael, beside her, seemed not to notice the temperature at all. "I owe you a significant debt of gratitude," she said, as they reached the bottom of the steps. "You spent your entire evening protecting a stranger from a problem that isn't yours. It occupied the time," he said simply. She looked at him. "That is an extraordinarily modest way to describe what you did." The edge of his mouth moved again, that almost smile. How would you describe it? Remarkable and slightly suspicious. She held his gaze. You knew court protocol perfectly. You knew exactly how to handle Valen, not just physically but politically. You knew my name before I gave it. You moved through that room as though she stopped herself. As though, he prompted quiet. As though you owned it, she said finally. He looked at her for a moment, and she thought, for just a breath, that he was going to tell her something true. Then, from behind them, came the sound of running footsteps on stone. She turned to see a young man in palace livery. The deep blue and gold, unmistakable even in the dim lantern light, reached the bottom of the steps and bow sharply. Your Grace. The footman's voice was breathless. Forgive the interruption. His Majesty has been asking for you. He requests your presence at the palace before midnight. The world tilted, not physically. Nothing so dramatic. Just the sentence rearranged itself in Katerina's mind with the slow, inevitable weight of something very heavy finding its true level. Your Grace. She turned back to the man beside her, to Raphael, who was looking at the footman with the patient, unsurprised expression of a man who had been expecting the interruption and was mildly annoyed only by its timing. Tell His Majesty I will be there within a half hour, he said. The footman bowed and retreated. The night was very quiet. Katerina stared at the man who had spent the last hour calling her my love and guiding her through Thornwell's ballroom, as though she were the most important person in the room. Raphael, she said carefully. Yes. What is your surname? He looked at her. The gray eyes were steady, patient, and carrying, she realized now, the faint shadow of something she hadn't been able to name all evening. The particular quality of a man who has been something very specific for a very long time and has grown accustomed to the weight of it. Vane, he said. Raphael Vane. She had heard that name in drawing rooms and morning papers and political circles for as long as she could remember, always spoken in the specific tone people reserve for forces of nature. Not feared, precisely. Not admired, precisely. Simply acknowledged, as one acknowledges Winter, the Duke of Ashgrove, the king's closest advisor. The man who had negotiated 3 border treaties, dissolved 2 corrupt parliamentary coalitions, and reportedly once ended a duel before it began simply by appearing on the field. He had spent the evening pretending to be her husband. You knew exactly who I was, she said, her voice very even. From the moment I approached you. Yes, and you still. Why? Raphael was quiet for a moment. Then, because you were in danger, and you asked. He said it as simply as if it were obvious. As if that were sufficient. As if dukes spent their evenings at galas watching for women in trouble and stepping in when asked. Her carriage had arrived. A footman was holding the door. She stood at the threshold of it, looking back at him, trying to locate the words for what she wanted to say. She had, she realized, at least 12 questions she needed answers to, and absolutely no authority to demand any of them. Good night, then, she managed. Raphael inclined his head. Good night, Miss Ashford. Not my love anymore. Miss Ashford. The distance restored, neat and clean, between one world and hers. She climbed into the carriage. The door closed. Through the small window, as the vehicle pulled away, she saw him still standing at the base of the Thornwell steps, still, straight, the cold not touching him, watching her go. She told herself that the warmth in her chest was simply relief that the evening was over. She told herself that 3 times on the drive home. She didn't entirely believe it any of the 3 times. She was still at her writing desk the following morning, composing her 4th draft of a letter to her solicitor that still hadn't found the right tone, when her housekeeper appeared at the door of the study with the expression of a woman who has encountered something she lacks the professional vocabulary for. There is a gentleman, my lady. Mrs. Potts said the word gentleman with the careful emphasis of someone who suspects it may be an understatement. He did not give a card. He said you would know him. He is. She paused, collected herself. He is waiting in the front parlor, Katerina already knew. She didn't know how she knew. Some combination of the housekeeper's expression and the particular quality of her own heartbeat in the 3 seconds between sentences. She set down her pen, smoothed her morning dress, and went downstairs. He was standing by the window when she entered. Not sitting, standing, with his hands clasped behind his back, looking out at the grey London street with the same quality of stillness she remembered from the night before. He had come in a plain carriage. He wore no insignia, and yet the parlor, which had always struck Katerina as a reasonably proportioned room, felt considerably smaller with him in it. He turned when she entered, and something in his expression was different from last night, less guarded, more deliberate, the expression of a man who has made a decision and arrived to state it. "Duke Vane," she said. "Raphael," he corrected quietly. "If you're willing." She folded her hands at her waist. "What brings you here?" He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Lord Vallon called on his legal counsel this morning at 7 o'clock. My people were informed. He said my people the way other men say my secretary, simply, practically, as though intelligence networks were standard household staff. He intends to file the betrothal claim formally by the end of the week, before your solicitor's challenge can be properly mounted. He has 2 magistrates he's spoken to privately." He paused. "It will not be a fair fight." Katerina felt the cold again, despite the parlor fire. "You've been watching this situation since last night. Since you investigated Lord Valen overnight?" "I had the outline before last night," he said with no particular emphasis. "Your father's creditors were a matter of some general awareness in certain circles. Valen's interest in acquiring the Ashford contracts was flagged to me some time ago as a secondary concern in a larger matter I was already managing." He stopped. "I did not know about you specifically until I saw you at the gala." "You were already investigating Valen," she said slowly, working through it. "And then I walked up to you and asked you to pretend to be my husband." "Yes." She stared at him. "That is either a remarkable coincidence or—" "A remarkable coincidence," he said, and something in his tone suggested he found it faintly remarkable himself. "I am not in the habit of manufacturing situations, Miss Ashford. I have enough genuine ones to manage." She almost smiled at that. "Almost. Why are you here?" she asked again. "What is it you're actually proposing?" Raphael held her gaze. He did not look away, and he did not soften what came next with unnecessary preamble. "Marry me," he said, formally, legally, on paper with all the protections that entails. He continued before she could speak. "Valen's claim becomes void the moment you are the documented wife of another man of equal or superior standing. The legal challenge becomes unnecessary. Your family's remaining assets are protected under the Ashgrove Estate's legal umbrella, which is, as I imagine you understand, rather difficult to threaten." He paused. "In return, I ask nothing of you that you do not choose to give. You would have your own rooms, your own household management, your own affairs. Our public appearances together would be limited to what is politically necessary. The arrangement dissolves quietly when you choose to end it, with a settlement that will ensure you never face a situation like Valen again." Katerina was very still. "You are proposing a contract marriage," she said carefully, "to a woman you met 12 hours ago." "I am proposing a solution," he said, "to a problem I have some interest in resolving regardless. You simply happen to be its most direct variable." "How practical," she said, and was surprised to hear no bitterness in it. She meant it, actually. After 6 months of grief and legal maneuvers and the slow erosion of everything her father had built, someone arriving with a plan, a clear, frank, executable plan, felt less like arrogance and more like air. "There is one condition," Raphael said. She braced. "Yes? You tell me the truth about what you need, what the estate needs, what is actually at risk." He held her gaze. "I will not be managed or maneuvered. If we do this, I need to know the full picture, not the version you've been giving your solicitor to avoid worrying him." Katerina looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the second set of books she'd found in her father's study, the offshore accounts, the name she didn't recognize, the figure at the bottom of the final column that had made her sit down very abruptly on the study floor and breathe very carefully for several minutes. She thought about how she hadn't told anyone about those books, not her solicitor, not her sister, not anyone. "If I tell you the full picture," she said slowly, "can you actually do something about it? Or are you making an offer based on an outline that the full picture would change?" Raphael's expression did not flicker. "Tell me," he said simply, "and we'll find out." She looked at this man, this composed, impossible, winter-eyed stranger who had stepped into her crisis last night without hesitation and arrived at her door this morning with a solution, and made the calculation that had always come naturally to her, the one that weighed risk against the alternative, fear against necessity. Then she sat down, and she told him everything. The Duke of Ashgrove listened without interruption for 27 minutes. He asked 3 questions, each precise, each aimed at exactly the weight-bearing wall of the problem she'd described, and when she finished, He sat quietly for a moment with the information she'd given him, and she watched him do what she had been trying to do for 6 months. Find the shape of it, find where it could be managed. The offshore account names, he said finally. I know 2 of them. She stared. You. They are not creditors, he said. They are associates of Vallon, which means your father's debt was not accumulated through gambling alone. He looked at her. Miss Ashford, your father may not have made these promises willingly. The parlor was very quiet. Outside, London went about its gray December morning, entirely indifferent to the fact that Katerina Ashford's entire understanding of the last 2 years had just shifted, quietly and irrevocably, on its axis. She did not cry. She was not built for crying in front of strangers. But her hands, folded in her lap, tightened until the knuckles went white. And Raphael Vane, the Duke of Ashgrove, who was not supposed to be anything to her, who was a stranger and a convenience and a solution to a problem, said nothing. He simply sat across from her in the small parlor, steady and present, and let her have the moment without requiring her to perform composure for his benefit. It was, she thought, one of the kindest things anyone had done for her since her father died, which was perhaps the most dangerous thing about him. She agreed to the marriage 3 days later. The paperwork was handled quietly by Raphael's solicitor, a brisk, efficient woman named Mrs. Carew, who appeared to have seen everything and found none of it remarkable. The ceremony was private, attended only by witnesses required by law, conducted in a registry office on a Thursday morning with winter light coming flat through tall windows. Raphael stood beside her at the clerk's desk in his plain dark coat, and when the moment came to sign, he signed first and slid the document to her without ceremony, without flourish, without any of the theater she had prepared herself to endure. She signed, and that was that. She was, on paper, the Duchess of Ashgrove. The drive to Ashgrove House, his London residence, where she would take rooms in the West Wing, was quiet. The city moved past the carriage windows in its usual winter indifference. Raphael sat across from her and said nothing, which she was beginning to understand was not coldness, but simply his natural register. He was a man who did not fill silence with noise, who waited until he had something worth saying. You're going to regret this, she said, watching the street outside. Why? Because you've married a woman with a complicated estate, a suspicious set of financial records, and a temperament that has been described by at least 3 people in the last month as formidable. 3 people, he said. Is that the exact count? She looked at him. 4, if you include my solicitor. The corner of his mouth moved. I find it very useful, he said. In my experience, the alternative is worse. She turned back to the window. But something in her chest had shifted, barely, like a room rearranging itself by 1 degree. Raphael. Yes. What exactly is your interest in Vallon? Not the part that involves me, the other part. She kept her voice even. You said he was a secondary concern in a larger matter. I'd like to know what I've walked into. A beat of quiet. Then, a parliamentary corruption inquiry. Vallon is connected to several men who have been manipulating land registry outcomes in the northern counties, the offshore. Accounts you found in your father's records, if they connect to Vallon's associates, as I believe they do, would provide evidence I've been missing for 8 months. She absorbed this. So I am, she said carefully, not just a woman in trouble. I am a variable with useful evidence. You are both, he said, without evasion. I told you I would not manufacture situations. I am telling you what is true. Your crisis and my inquiry have become the same problem. He met her gaze. That does not change the fact that Vallon needed to be stopped on your behalf specifically. The two are not mutually exclusive. She studied him. You are aggressively honest for a man who works in politics. I am, he agreed. Most people would have left that second part out. Most people, he said, are not married to you. She didn't have an answer for that. Neither, apparently, did he. They rode the rest of the way to Ashgrove House in silence, but it was a different kind of silence than the one they'd started with. It had, Katerina thought, the texture of something that was just beginning. She did not expect what Ashgrove House would feel like. She had prepared herself for grandeur that was excluded, for the specific cold beauty of a house that existed to impress rather than to inhabit. She had lived in houses like that. Her family's own estate had become one after her father died, all the warmth draining out of it with him. Ashgrove House was grand, undeniably. The ceilings soared. The library occupied an entire wing. The dining room seated 40 and had not, she suspected, seated 40 in some time. But the housekeeper who met them at the door, a stout, practical woman named Mrs. Everly, had lit a fire in every room Katerina would use. There were flowers on the writing desk in her study, winter roses in a simple vase, the kind of arrangement that took thought rather than spectacle. Her preferred tea was already on the tray beside the chair nearest the window, though she had never mentioned her preference to anyone in this household. She found out later, from Mrs. Everly, that the Duke had sent a list of specifications 3 days before the wedding. He had included her preferred tea. She stood in her sitting room that first evening, looking at the winter roses, and told herself very firmly that a man being thorough was not the same as a man being attentive. She told herself that, and remained unconvinced. 3 weeks into the marriage, Katerina made a mistake. It was small, entirely understandable, and it cost her more than she had calculated. She attended Lady Mercer's afternoon reception alone. Raphael had been called to the palace that morning, one of those summons that arrived without explanation and required immediate departure, his carriage gone before she'd finished her breakfast. He had not asked her to stay home. He had not suggested she wait. Their arrangement, after all, was built on the explicit foundation that she would manage her own affairs and he would manage his. So she went. Lady Mercer's drawing room was everything Katerina had been navigating carefully since the wedding. The particular atmosphere of London society in the process of revising its opinion. 3 weeks ago she had been the quietly pitied Ashford girl, asset-stripped and circled by creditors. Now she was the Duchess of Ashgrove, which meant the room rearranged itself differently. The attention was the same. The calculation behind it was simply pointed in a more favorable direction. She handled it competently. She always handled things competently. It was, unfortunately, both her greatest skill and the thing that made people consistently underestimate the effort involved. She was discussing the winter charity exhibition with Lady Hartwell when he appeared. Lord Caius Mercer, Lady Mercer's nephew, recently returned from the continent, young and easy in his manner and possessed of the particular confidence of someone who had never had a reason to be anything else. He was handsome in the uncomplicated way of men, who have always been told so. He smiled at her as though they were already friends. Duchess Ashgrove, he said it lightly, with the faint emphasis that suggested he found the title amusing without quite being rude about it. I don't think we've been properly introduced. Caius Mercer. I've been hearing your name a lot since I returned. Lord Mercer. She kept her tone pleasant and unrevealing. Welcome back to London. 3 weeks married and already attending receptions alone. He said it with a smile, conversational, nothing barbed in the surface of it. Is the Duke very busy or simply very trusting? Both, I imagine. She smiled back with equal pleasantness. Excuse me, I heard about your father. His voice changed, just slightly. Quieter, more genuine. I'm sorry, he was a good man. My uncle knew him, thought very highly of him. She stilled. Because that was true, she could hear it. And because grief, even managed grief, even grief she had carefully organized into its appropriate compartment and closed the lid on, still responded to unexpected sincerity like a bruise responding to pressure. Thank you, she said, and meant it. They spoke for perhaps 10 minutes. Nothing remarkable, nothing that crossed any line she could clearly identify. He was pleasant and intelligent, and he spoke of her father with genuine warmth, and she found herself grateful for it in a way that made her feel briefly, oddly, like herself again. Not the Duchess of Ashgrove with her careful posture and her calculated responses, but simply Katerina, who had loved her father and missed him every morning. She left Lady Mercer's reception an hour later and returned to Ashgrove House without thinking very much about the conversation at all. Raphael was home when she arrived. She knew before she saw him. The house had a particular quality when he was in it, some shift in atmosphere that she had begun to notice without meaning to, like a barometric pressure change, like the air before lightning. He was in the study, standing at his desk, reviewing documents. He looked up when she appeared in the doorway, and she registered his gaze. The automatic sweep of it, checking her, confirming she was present and unharmed, before it returned to the papers. How was Lady Mercer's? He asked. Manageable. She came further into the room, setting her gloves on the side table. I didn't know you'd be back. The meeting concluded early. He turned a page. Did anyone cause difficulty? No. She paused. Lord Mercer was there, Lady Mercer's nephew. He was kind to my father. The page turning stopped. It was so slight she almost missed it. A half-second interruption in the steady rhythm of his reading, a barely perceptible pause before it resumed. She would not have noticed it at all 3 weeks ago. She noticed it now. Lord Caius Mercer, Raphael said. Yes, recently returned from Rome. So he mentioned. She watched the side of his face. Do you know him? I know of him. Another page. Then with the same level tone he used for everything. He has a considerable reputation with unattached women. I am not unattached, she said. No. His voice was perfectly even. You are not. Another silence. She studied him. The controlled stillness of his posture, the slight set of his jaw, the way his attention was fixed on the documents with just slightly more deliberateness than the documents required. Raphael, she said. Yes. Is this bothering you? He looked up then. The gray eyes met hers directly, and she saw it, brief, almost disciplined into nothing, but there. A flash of something sharp and warm and contained, the way a fire is contained in a grate. Still burning, simply managed. Should it not? He said quietly. She held his gaze. Her heartbeat had done something complicated and unauthorized. We have an arrangement, she said carefully. We have a marriage, he said, just as carefully. And then he looked back down at his papers and the conversation was closed. Not harshly, simply closed, the way he closed everything he wasn't ready to examine in daylight. She stood in the study for a moment longer than she needed to. Then she went upstairs. She stood at the window of her sitting room and looked at the winter street below and told herself, with great firmness, that the way her chest felt right now was not longing, was not the beginning of something she had not planned for, was simply the entirely reasonable response of a person under a great deal of stress who had experienced a moment of unexpected proximity. She was not convincing herself. The first threat arrived 4 days later. It came as a letter delivered to Ashgrove House in the Morning Post, addressed to her in handwriting she didn't recognize. No seal, no return direction. She opened it at the breakfast table before Raphael came down, which was perhaps fortunate, because the contents required a moment of private recalibration before she could look at anything calmly. You have something that belongs to us. The account records your father kept. We know you found them. Return them quietly and step away from the Duke's inquiry, and nothing further will occur. Make trouble, and the trouble will find you instead. No signature. Of course no signature. She folded the letter with steady hands and slipped it into the pocket of her morning dress, poured her tea, buttered her toast, and was reading the morning paper with every appearance of composure when Raphael appeared 7 minutes later. He sat down, accepted his coffee, unfolded his own section of the paper. You found something in the post, he said, without looking up. She stared at him. How could you possibly... Your shoulders are doing something specific. He turned a page. They do it when you're managing information. She looked at her shoulders. They appeared entirely normal to her. That is an unsettling level of observation. It's been 3 weeks. He finally looked at her. Show me. She handed him the letter. He read it once, then again. His expression did not change in any dramatic way. But she was learning to read the subtle register of him, the slight tightening around the eyes, the almost imperceptible shift in how he held his jaw. She had begun to think of it as his temperature dropping. When Raphael became very still and very quiet, the temperature in the room went down. It went down now. When did this arrive? With this morning's post. I noticed it had no seal before I opened it. You should have waited for me. I didn't know what it was. He looked at her steadily. In future, anything with no return direction and no seal waits for me. The instruction landed with quiet authority, and she found, to her own mild surprise, that she didn't bristle at it. Because it wasn't controlled. It was protection, stated plainly, from a man who had apparently calculated threats before breakfast with the same ease most people managed eggs. They know about the account records, she said. Yes, he set the letter down. Which confirms the records are what I thought they were, and that Vallen's associates are watching this house. He was quiet for a moment. I'm moving 2 additional members of my household security to the exterior rotation today. You'll likely not notice them. They are very good at not being noticed. But I need you to tell me your plans for the next 3 days, everywhere you intend to go. I have Lady Hartwell's luncheon tomorrow, a meeting with Mrs. Carew on Wednesday regarding the Ashford estate transition, and I was considering all of those are manageable. He folded the letter and pocketed it. I'll accompany you to the Hartwell luncheon. She blinked. That is an extremely informal occasion. It will raise questions then it will raise questions. He picked up his coffee cup. Drink your tea, Katerina. It's getting cold. She drank her tea and tried very hard not to examine the warm, unreasonable, inconvenient feeling that came from having someone insist on being beside her. He came to the Hartwell luncheon. He was, by any standard of the occasion, the most powerful person in the room, and he arrived without announcement and sat beside her and engaged Lady Hartwell's other guests with the same focused attention he gave everything. Not performing sociability, but genuinely present, genuinely listening, asking questions that showed he'd actually processed what was said. Lady Hartwell was charmed. Lady Hartwell's daughter was visibly enchanted. 3 other women at the table underwent subtle but unmistakable recalibrations of their estimation of Katerina Ashford. Now, Katerina. Vain, who had apparently produced from somewhere a husband who arrived uninvited to luncheons and sat at her left hand and quietly ensured, through the precise geometry of his attention, that no one at that table treated her as anything less than exactly what she was. Lord Caius Mercer was also there. She hadn't known. Lady Hartwell had a broad definition of luncheon that apparently encompassed 16 people and 3 additional courses. Mercer arrived 20 minutes after the meal began and was seated, by the exigencies of the table arrangement, directly across from her. He smiled when he saw her. A genuine, uncomplicated smile of someone pleased to encounter a familiar face. Then his gaze moved to the man seated beside her, and the smile became something more considered, without losing its pleasantness. Duke Ashgrove, he said, with a correct nod. I don't think we've met. Caius Mercer. Lord Mercer. Raphael acknowledged him with equal correctness. Nothing more. Nothing less. But his hand, which had been resting on the table, moved, very slightly, to the back of her chair, not touching her, simply present, an inch behind her spine. She felt it without seeing it, the way you feel weather changing. Mercer engaged her in conversation across the table during the second course. Easy, intelligent conversation about an exhibition she'd mentioned at his aunt's reception, about a book they'd apparently both read, about her plans for the Ashford estate's charitable endowments. He was attentive without being forward, interested without overstepping. And Raphael beside her said absolutely nothing. He ate. He conversed with Lady Hartwell on his other side. He performed the entire function of a husband at a luncheon with flawless composure. But she was aware of him the way you're aware of a storm still some distance off. By the quality of the air, the particular charge of everything adjacent to it. On the drive home afterward, the carriage was quiet for several minutes. Then Raphael said, Mercer is intelligent. Yes, she agreed carefully. He's also persistent. He was making conversation at a luncheon. He was making conversation with you. Specifically, there is a distinction. A pause. He will call on you. She looked at him. You cannot possibly know that. He asked Lady Hartwell twice whether you attended her events regularly. The gray eyes were on the window, the city moving past. He was determining a pattern. He will call. She was quiet for a moment. And if he does? Raphael turned his head and looked at her. The directness of it, the full, focused weight of his attention, unmediated, unguarded for once, hit her somewhere beneath her composure. Then you will tell him, he said quietly, that you are not available. It was not a command. It didn't have the texture of a command. It had the texture of something considerably more complicated. A request from a man who did not make requests easily, wrapped in the language of certainty, because vulnerability was not, apparently, in his available vocabulary. Raphael, she said, yes, this is a contract marriage. I am aware. You said, I know what I said. His voice was very quiet. I also know what 3 weeks have been, and I know the difference between what I planned and what has occurred. He looked back at the window. Disregard it if you choose. I am simply telling you what is true. The carriage moved through the London streets. The winter light came gray and flat through the glass. Katerina sat with her hands folded in her lap and felt the careful architecture of everything she had decided about this marriage. The clean lines of it, the useful distances, the agreement that nothing would be required that she did not choose to give. Feel, for the first time, insufficient, like a house built for a particular kind of weather that had since changed. She didn't say anything else. Neither did he. But when they reached Ashgrove House and he helped her from the carriage, his hand held hers a moment longer than necessity required, and she let it. The betrayal came on a Thursday. She would remember it as a Thursday, because Thursdays had already begun to carry a particular weight in her mind, the day of the week when Raphael had no morning appointments, when they had fallen into the habit of reviewing the Ashford account records together over a late breakfast, when the house felt most like a house and least like an arrangement. She was in his study. He had given her access without ceremony, simply unlocked the connecting door one morning, and said the room was available when she needed it, reviewing the offshore account correspondence when Mrs. Everly knocked. "There's a gentleman from the palace," the housekeeper said. "One of the Duke's staff. He left a document he said required the Duchess's attention immediately." The document was a single page, official seal, palace letterhead, and it contained, in precise bureaucratic language, a copy of a letter that was apparently already in circulation, making its way through the appropriate parliamentary offices and several well-placed social hands. A letter bearing Katerina's name, in handwriting that looked, at first and second glance, remarkably like hers, addressed to Lord Edric Vallon, detailing, in terms that would be comprehensible only to someone with knowledge of the account records, the exact evidence she had shared with Raphael, the offshore names, the financial structure, the connection to Vallon's associates in the parliamentary corruption inquiry. Providing it, the letter implied, willingly, as a gesture of goodwill to Lord Vallon, in exchange for dismissal of the betrothal claim. She read it twice. Then she set it down very carefully on the desk, and sat, and looked at the winter sky through the study window for a long moment. She had not written this letter. She had not written a single word of it, but it was very, very good. The handwriting was studied, close enough that anyone without a precise sample to compare would not question it. The knowledge contained in it was real, drawn accurately from the records, which meant whoever had created it had access either to those records or to someone who did, and it was already circulating. By the time Raphael came home, it had reached 3 offices and 1 member of the Palace Advisory Council. He came into the study and she saw it in his face before he spoke, not anger, which she had been braced for, but something harder and colder, and in some ways more difficult, the expression of a man confronting evidence that conflicts with something he had already decided to believe. "There is a letter," he said. "I know. I have it." She pushed it across the desk. "I did not write it." He looked at the letter. He looked at her. "The handwriting is close but not precise. Look at the capital D. I form it differently. The upper loop closes to the right. This one closes left." She kept her voice even. She would not perform distress for him. She had not written the letter, and she would not act as though she had. "Someone studied my handwriting and replicated it carefully, but they were working from a limited sample." He looked at the letter for a long moment. She watched him. She watched him weigh it, the evidence against her, the weeks of working beside her, the weight of what he knew of her against the precision of what someone had constructed. She watched the calculation and told herself that the outcome did not matter to her as much as it did. She was lying to herself. The outcome mattered enormously. "The account details in this letter," he said slowly. "Whoever wrote this had access to information that only we have discussed, you and I. And your solicitor," she said. "And whoever delivered those palace documents to Mrs. Everly this morning. And whoever has access to your correspondence." His jaw tightened. "My staff. I'm not saying it was your staff." Her voice was steady. "I'm saying the information came from somewhere inside this house, which means this was not Vallon acting alone. Someone inside your world helped him." The temperature dropped. She watched him absorb it, not just the letter, but the implication beneath it, that the breach was close, that someone he had trusted with access to the Ashgrove household had provided this material. He set the letter down. "You should leave London for a few days." She stared. "I beg your pardon?" "Until I locate the source, I am not leaving," she said. The steadiness in her voice surprised even her. "I will not be moved from this house because someone has made a forgery. That is precisely what they want. To create distance between us, to make you doubt me, and to remove me from your confidence and your inquiry." She held his gaze. "I did not write that letter, Raphael. If you believe I did, tell me so directly. But I will not run simply because it is convenient for someone else that I should." He was very still. She watched him look at her, the full, unguarded attention of him, none of his composure performing anything, simply looking. And she waited with her hands flat on the desk and her heart beating rather loudly in a chest that felt entirely too small for what was happening inside it. "I don't believe you wrote it," he said, quietly. Finally, the relief was so swift and complete it almost undid her composure. She held it together through sheer practice. "Then let's find out who did," she said. He sent her north anyway. Not in retreat. He was careful to frame it correctly, and she was careful to hear it correctly. He sent her to the Ashgrove country estate with Mrs. Everly and 2 members of his household security, while he remained in London to locate the source of the breach. The country estate would provide a credible reason for her absence from the city. Whoever had created the letter would assume their strategy had worked, and meanwhile, Raphael would move without the constraint of protecting her in the city, while simultaneously investigating within his own household. It was logical. She understood that. She still hated it. The estate was 2 hours north of London, a vast, quiet place of old stone and formal gardens under winter-bare trees. She arrived in the late afternoon, and Mrs. Everly settled her into the east wing with the same quiet efficiency the woman brought to everything. That night, alone in a bedroom that was perfectly appointed and absolutely silent, Katerina sat at the writing desk and looked at the blank paper in front of her and admitted, only to herself, only in the privacy of that silent room, what she had been refusing to admit for approximately 2.5 weeks. She was not in a contract marriage anymore. She was not sure precisely when it had stopped being a contract marriage. It might have been the winter roses on the first day. It might have been him reading the threat letter in silence and then simply saying, "Drink your tea, Katerina." It might have been his hand on the back of her chair at the Hartwell luncheon, not touching her, simply present, an inch behind her spine. It might have been the way he said the word marriage, not arrangement, not contract, marriage, in a tone that suggested he knew the difference. She did not write the letter she'd been pretending she was going to write. She sat in the quiet of the country estate and looked at the winter night through the window and thought about a man standing in a doorway with his temperature dropped to dangerous and his jaw set and his gray eyes making the only decision that mattered. "I don't believe you wrote it." 4 words. And she had felt them the way you feel ground after falling. He came on the second night. She heard the carriage on the gravel drive before she saw the light, not the household staff's usual arrivals, which came around the back, but a direct approach to the front, fast and purposeful. She was at the window of her sitting room before she'd consciously decided to move. 1 carriage, no Triders, just him. He was soaked through. The rain had started an hour ago, the particular relentless rain of an English winter night, and he had clearly not stopped for it. She was at the top of the stairs when he came through the front door, and Mrs. Everly was behind her with a lamp, and the hall lights caught him. Dark hair flat with rain, coat saturated. The careful composure of him entirely undone by weather and what she suspected was a very fast drive. He looked up and found her at the top of the stairs. "I found the source," he said, without preamble. "What of my correspondence staff?" Valen had reached him through a family connection 3 months before our marriage. He had access to everything. A pause. "He has been removed, and the matter has been referred to the appropriate authorities. The forged letter has been formally discredited. Valen's legal position is now considerably weaker than it was this morning." She came down the stairs, slowly. "You drove 2 hours in the rain," she said, "to tell me that tonight." "Yes, you could have sent a letter. Yes." She reached the bottom of the stairs. They were standing 6 feet apart in the entrance hall, and the rain was coming against the windows in steady sheets, and Mrs. Everly had developed sudden pressing business in another part of the house. "Why didn't you send a letter?" she asked. He looked at her. The gray eyes were direct and tired and carrying something she recognized because she had seen it once before. The day she had told him everything about her father's accounts, when he had simply sat across from her and let her have the moment. That quality of undefended presence. A man with all his armor removed, not because it was gone, but because he had chosen to set it down. "Because I have faced kings," he said, quietly, steadily. "I have negotiated treaties and dissolved coalitions and walked into rooms where the balance of power in 3 counties depended on my composure." A pause. "I sat in London for 2 hours after finding the source and making the calls and doing every practical thing there was to do, and I could not." He stopped, gathered himself with the effort of a man unaccustomed to the vocabulary he was reaching for. "I could not stop thinking about you in this house, alone. I could not determine why the practical resolution was insufficient when the practical resolution is always sufficient." Another pause. That was unfamiliar. I chose to address it directly rather than wait. The hall was very quiet. That is, she said carefully, a very composed way to say that you missed me. Something moved across his face, something rare and warm and slightly wrecked. Yes, he said, that is what it was. She crossed the 6 feet between them. She placed her hand on his chest, over his soaked coat, over the rain-cold fabric, and felt his heartbeat under her palm, faster than his composure suggested. You are completely drenched, she said. Yes. You drove 2 hours in the rain without stopping. I'm aware. For a woman who was perfectly safe and well-informed and entirely capable of waiting for a letter. Also aware. She looked up at him. Raphael. Yes. I am not in a contract marriage anymore. The gray eyes held hers. Something in them had been very carefully held for 3 weeks, very carefully managed, kept behind glass, maintained at the controlled distance of a man who had decided what he wanted and was not certain he was permitted to want it. She watched it now, very quietly and completely, let go. His hand came up to her face, gentle, the way he was always gentle with things he valued, precise and careful and without any wasted motion. His thumb traced the line of her cheekbone. No, he said softly. Neither am I. She returned to London the following morning. He rode with her in the carriage, and the 2 hours passed in a conversation that was different from every previous conversation, lighter in some ways, more grounded in others, as if the thing they had been managing around had dissolved overnight and left the air cleaner. They were still building something. She was clear-eyed about that. Love, real love, the kind worth the name, was not built in 3 weeks or on the floor of an entrance hall in a rainstorm. It was built in the 1,000 ordinary moments that followed, in the disagreements navigated with honesty, in the quiet mornings and the shared work and the gradual, irreversible accumulation of knowing someone. But the foundation, she thought, watching his profile against the winter morning, the foundation was real. It had been real, she suspected, since a stranger at a winter gala had said 2 words and placed his hand at the small of her back. Very well. Lord Edric Vallon was formally charged 6 weeks later. The parliamentary corruption inquiry, with the account records Katerina had provided, and the testimony of Raphael's former correspondence staff, produced evidence sufficient to bring 3 men before the appropriate authorities, Vallon among them. The betrothal claim against the Ashford estate was declared void. The offshore accounts were frozen and referred for investigation. The Ashford estate, slowly, began to breathe again. Katerina spent 2 mornings a week working with Mrs. Carew on its recovery. She spent her afternoons in the Ashgrove Library, which was the finest room she had ever inhabited. She spent her evenings with Raphael in the study or the drawing room, or walking the winter gardens when the weather permitted, in conversation that continued to surprise her with its range and its honesty, and the occasional dry observation that made her laugh in a way she hadn't in some time. He was not easy. She had not expected it to be easy. He was contained and controlled and constitutionally resistant to saying the vulnerable thing first, and she was formidable and self-sufficient, and constitutionally resistant to needing anything from anyone. They managed, between them, an extraordinary quantity of careful honesty with great effort and occasional exasperation and the growing, unmistakable warmth of 2 people discovering that someone else's particular difficulty is not an obstacle but a kind of company. Lord Caius Mercer called, once, in early February. Katerina received him briefly in the front parlor. He was pleasant and intelligent, and he left after 20 minutes with the particular grace of a man who had taken a reading of the room and found it accurately occupied. Raphael, who had been in the study, said nothing when she came upstairs afterward, but he brought her tea, her preferred blend, no sugar, correctly warm, and sat across from her, and opened his book, and the silence between them was the best kind of silence. The kind that doesn't need filling because everything necessary is already present. On a cold February evening, in the Ashgrove drawing room, with the fire burning low and the household quiet around them, Raphael set down the parliamentary report he had been reading and looked at her. She was at the writing desk, her own correspondence, Ashford estate business, the charitable endowment she was rebuilding, and she felt his gaze before she looked up. "What?" she said. "I have been thinking," he said, "about what I said in the entrance hall at the country estate." She set down her pen. "Which part specifically?" "That I was not in a contract marriage anymore." He was looking at her with that direct, undefended attention, the armor set aside, his temperature warm for once, his eyes carrying something she had watched accumulate over weeks and was now, apparently, being formally addressed. I said that in the context of an immediate moment. I want to say it again now, in a quiet room with no rain and sufficient time for you to consider it properly. A pause. I did not marry you for the inquiry. I did not remain in this with you for strategy. I remained in this with you because... He stopped, worked through the vocabulary with visible effort. Because waking up in a house where you are is different from waking up in a house where you are not. And I have been without a great many things in my life without much difficulty. That, I find, would not be without difficulty. The drawing room was very quiet. Katerina looked at this man, this impossible, composed, winter-eyed man who drove 2 hours in the rain and read her shoulders and included her preferred tea on a household specification list and had been, she understood now, paying careful and complete attention to her since the moment she walked up to him at a winter gala and said something desperate. "Raphael," she said. "Yes. That is, without question, the least romantic declaration I have ever heard." The corner of his mouth moved. The real smile, the rare one, the one she had been cataloging since January. "I know," he said. "I am working on it. You don't need to work on it." She rose from the desk and crossed the room. She took his hands in hers, both of them, and felt them close around hers with the careful certainty of a man holding something he intends to keep. "I think," she said, "that a man who tells the truth when it is difficult, and shows up when he doesn't have to, and drives 2 hours in the rain simply because waiting was insufficient, that man does not need better romantic vocabulary." "That is very generous," he said quietly. "It is accurate." She looked up at him. "I love you. I want to say it first because I think you've been waiting to say it until you were certain I felt it, and I want to remove that particular burden from you." He looked at her for a moment that stretched long enough to be a full sentence on its own. Then, "I love you." Simply, finally, with the quality of something that has been true for some time and is relieved, at last, to be said aloud. He kissed her. Properly this time. Not the question of the entrance hall, but the answer. The kind of kiss that isn't going anywhere because it has arrived. They were married in truth on a Saturday morning in March. Not remarried. There was no ceremony for that, no legal requirement to revisit. They were already, on paper, formally, irrevocably, each other's. But Raphael had arranged something small and exact, as he arranged everything. The Ashgrove House chapel, which had not been used in years and smelled of old stone and beeswax, opened and lit with morning light through the tall windows. A priest, their witnesses, Mrs. Everly, Mrs. Carew, and Lord Hartwell, who had apparently been Raphael's oldest friend for 20 years and had been describing this outcome as inevitable since December. Katerina wore ivory. Not the elaborate architecture of a formal wedding, but a gown that was simply and exactly beautiful, the kind that made the woman wearing it the point rather than the dress. Raphael, standing in the chapel waiting for her, looked at her when she appeared in the doorway with the expression she had come to understand was his truest one, the one beneath the composure, beneath the authority, beneath the gray-eyed certainty that rooms would arrange themselves around him. Wonder. Unguarded and complete. She walked to him without haste. She had learned, these past months, that arriving was worth the whole journey. He took her hands. The chapel was warm. The morning light came through the windows and fell across both of them. "Ready?" she asked. "I have been," he said, "since a stranger walked up to me at a winter gala and asked me to pretend." She smiled. "You could have said no." "I could have," he agreed. "I was not going to." The priest began, and they spoke their words. Not contract language, not strategy, not the practical vocabulary of people managing problems. The true words, said simply, in full knowledge of what they meant. And outside, London continued its ordinary business, entirely indifferent to the fact that inside a small chapel in Ashgrove House, two people who had arrived at each other through desperation and coincidence, and 3 weeks of careful, accumulating attention were choosing each other, deliberately, completely, and for good. Some loves begin with grand gestures and declarations. Some begin with a desperate whisper to a stranger in a crowded room, and the stranger's quiet answer, and the slow, irreversible realization that the arrangement was never really an arrangement at all. Katerina Ashford did not plan to fall in love when she grabbed a stranger's arm at the Thornwell Winter Gala. She planned to survive the evening. She survived considerably more than that. And perhaps that is the lesson in all of it, that the bravest thing is not always the grand action. Sometimes it is the small, honest one, asking for help when you need it, telling the truth when it costs you, driving 2 hours in the rain because waiting is insufficient, and the person at the other end of the road matters more than the weather. Sometimes love is not a lightning strike. Sometimes it is a preferred tea, remembered without being told. A hand at the small of your back, not touching, simply present. A winter rose in a vase on the first morning. Sometimes the most powerful thing in the room is the quietest. If this story reached you, if you felt something in the careful way these two people found each other, then you are exactly who this channel was made for. We at the Duke Royal Tales believe in stories that stay with you. Stories that remind you that strength can be quiet, love can be earned, and the most unexpected beginnings can lead to the most extraordinary arrivals. If Katerina and Raphael's journey moved you, please like this video. It tells us to keep creating. Leave a comment below with your favorite moment from their story. We read every single one. And subscribe to the Duke Royal Tales so you are here for every chapter we release. Thank you for being here. Thank you for staying until the end. You make these stories worth telling. With love, the Duke Royal Tales.